My name is Jan Calamita. I'm the head of investment law and policy at the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's book launch discussion of Manifestations of Coherence and Investor-State Arbitration, a new book by my colleague, Dr. Haralampos Giannakopoulos, published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. Haralampos is a senior research fellow here at the Center for International Law, a member of the investment law and policy team, and someone that I've had the pleasure of working with since 2018. I've also had the pleasure of being a co-author with Harry on another book released last year on ASEAN and investor-state dispute settlement reform. Haralampos is a great colleague, a terrific scholar, and I'm especially happy to be able to open this book launch event today. I'm also very pleased to be able to welcome Professor Thomas Schultz of the University of Geneva, who will be our discussant following Haralampos's talk. Thomas is a professor of international arbitration at the University of Geneva and also a member of the faculty of King's College London. Among many research interests, Thomas is interested in legal philosophy as applied to arbitration concepts, which makes Thomas especially well suited to be our discussant today. He is, among other things, the founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Dispute Settlement and the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of International Arbitration. Well, with that, let me not take any more time and pass things directly on to Haralampos for his opening remarks. Harry, on to you.
Thank you, Janssen, for this very, very kind introduction, and good morning, Thomas, and thank you for agreeing to act as discussant for today's events, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you participants who are joining us today for this discussion on a book that I recently published. The book, as Janssen just mentioned, is about the concept of coherence, with particular emphasis on investment arbitration. And in my brief introduction, I just want to address 2 points. First is, why did I write this book? And second is, what is the book's main argument or main message? So why this book? So as you may know, over the past 10 or so years, there has been a sustained backlash against investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, for a variety of reasons, one of which being perceived incoherence in arbitral awards. And indeed, this perception of incoherence is a core driver of the ongoing discussions on ISDS reform at UNCITRAL's Working Group 3. And the proposed reform to address this issue or concern, at least from the point of view of the European Union and some other delegations, is the establishment of a multilateral investment court with an appellate function, or at least of an appellate mechanism. Now, looking at the debates and the discourse in literature about coherence and ISDS, I started getting the sense that the way in which we look at coherence is often incomplete and one-sided. It is incomplete because we tend to not give an independent meaning to coherence from related concepts that are of relevance and importance to law, like correctness or consistency or predictability. And we tend to treat all of them as interchangeable. And our way of looking at coherence is also one-sided, because often we ask questions like, does international investment law cohere, for instance, with international trade law? Or we ask questions like, does international investment law cohere within itself? And this is what in the book I sort of described as a top-down understanding of coherence. Now, there is nothing wrong with asking those kinds of questions, but I got the sense that this may be a question-begging way of looking at coherence in ISDS, especially if we're not quite sure what coherence is or means in the first place. So the question thus becomes, how can we hope to improve coherence in ISDS if we do not know how it enters into the very processes that develop international investment law day to day? That is to say, the practices and theory of legal reasoning and interpretation. This in the book I describe as a so-called bottom-up approach to understanding coherence. So the book is really a contribution to the overall debate on coherence in ISTS, but I'd say from a more jurisprudential and methodological perspective. So what is the main argument or the message of this book? I begin by my working understanding of coherence in the book is that coherence is an expression of the rational connection between the members of a whole in relation to a governing value or a governing principle that justifies that connection. So the strength of that connection is what we tend to describe as coherent or incoherent. And now this definition is, of course, to be adapted to the context on which we seek to view coherence in each case. And in this context is investment law and international law more generally. And so law has what some have called a dual dimension, right? So there's this social dimension, which favors sources, certainty, predictability, and there's also the ideal dimension, which favors justice, a moral imperativeness of outcomes, and a just allocation of burdens and benefits. And legal reasoning often reflects this. And so the book describes legal reasoning as reasoning of the practical kind, which means that it is generally not directed towards discovering some kind of scientific truth, but rather towards formulating a reasoned opinion and committing us to a course of action given the presence of a legal problem that requires resolution. And because of this, legal reasoning involves an exercise of framing questions and desired ends to be pursued within the constraints of a legal system, and of figuring out the best way to achieve those ends and answer those questions, again, within the constraints provided by a legal system. And so my core argument is that coherence in the context of legal reasoning takes a dual dimension that is somewhat similar. That is to say, it has an ideal dimension in finding the best possible combination between law's path dependency and aspirational character. And it also has a methodological dimension on how one gets to do all this through processes such as framing legal questions, placing those questions against an appropriate normative context that will contribute towards the answer, and so on. And in ISDS, such context may include shared understandings that we may or may not have about various norms, past practices and decisions or principles, as well as the arbitrator's own appreciation of their institutional role in that system. And it also involves working back and forth among those elements in a kind of reflective manner, making judgments about the instant case and about particular cases and general theories before one commits to a decision. In short, the argument is that there are multiple instances in judicial decision-making, including in ISDS, where considerations of coherence appear, and of which we should be aware. And this places a particular kind of moral responsibility to arbitrators as institutional actors in the system. And that was my sort of very brief introduction into the book, just to set the stage, and I'm happy to engage in a discussion.
Great to meet you again, Harry. Wonderful to be here with you to talk about your new book. I have a copy here. It's a fantastic book. I should perhaps add that I was one of the examiners of your PhD on which this book is based. I will do my best not to, out of reflex, replicate the discussion we had then. We are here to celebrate your book, and it is a book to be celebrated. I'll ask three. So today, the way we agreed, I'm speaking to the audience now, the way we agreed to do this with Harry is that it will be something of an interview. I'll ask questions to put questions to Harry, and he'll respond, and we'll take it from there. So I won't make any long comments. One or two of my questions are a bit long, but it'll be mostly a discussion. The questions I will ask will come from three main angles, or three hats that I could have. The first couple will be me as an author, that these will be questions about how you crafted the book. The second will be at least one question from me as an arbitrator, and the third will be a question from me as a scholar. Different kinds of questions in different categories. So as an author, my first question would be, well, why this topic? Why did you come to choose this topic? What drew you to it? And I'll immediately connect to the second question. How was the writing process? How did you put this all together? That's among others for the people who are listening to us today and who would like to write a similar great book like this, and where should they start from, and how should they go about writing it then?
So I guess, I mean, the reason how I came to this topic is precisely because coherence as a concept kind of kept coming in my readings about, in particular, about the uses of principles in legal reasoning. But there was never a clear understanding, at least in legal literature, about what coherence really entails, except that because it was a desirable thing to have in law. And so I was really, I guess, kind of curious to explore that concept further. Now, in terms of approaching this subject, it necessarily involved stepping out of the comfort zone of just reading legal sources, because it is quickly I discovered a topic that just spans the entire field of epistemology, and so the writing process was, I would say, both typical and a bit atypical for a piece of academic writing. It was typical in the sense that it involved the same processes of, reading, drafting, reading more, and drafting some more that every writer goes through at some point or other. But it was atypical in a few ways. And one way is it was a bit of a struggle trying to be precise in my writing when dealing with abstract conceptual or philosophical subjects. Lawyers, we tend to be quite precise in our writing, but not being trained in philosophy, it was a different exercise when engaging with a philosophical or conceptual work, because often the author's intentions in these works are not always clearly obvious, and sometimes they have to be gleaned and reconstructed by the reader. And in my case, that perhaps meant more redrafting than what would normally be required, as my understanding of what different authors may have meant changed over time, and with every new time I was reading a particular work. In writing this, a challenge that I also had was how to find ways to make those abstract conceptual discussions more practical or tangible. And so the way I chose to address this was through examples. And I took examples from a variety of sources, of course, other cases from ISDS or international law more generally, and academic writings, but also from news stories and sometimes films. And so the general sort of approach to writing was that I would often begin with a general or an exposition of what I was hoping to show in each chapter or in each section, followed by an examination of the more abstract or conceptual points that were pertinent, followed then by, as much as possible, examples that showcased those things in practice. And I guess just by having read some works in philosophy, that also kind of affected the writing style a bit. So in the writing style kind of oscillates sometimes in between a slightly looser style in the more abstract discussions to a more lawyer-like standard when discussing, for example, cases.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Why did you call the book? So the book is Manifestations of Coherence and Investor-State Arbitration. Why did you call it Manifestations of Coherence?
So I think the main message of the book is that coherence, both as an ideal and as a method of work, is part and parcel of legal reasoning. And so my main goal was not to argue that investment law or investor-state arbitration are coherent or that they're totally incoherent. Personally, to me, that seemed perhaps as a less interesting question compared to finding out where or how considerations of coherence appear in legal reasoning. And so my goal really was to show some of these places or some of these areas. And hence the choice of the word manifestations. And sort of the book points out to several such manifestations or areas. And one would be I would argue, the very structure of legal reasoning. Another would be the mechanics of treaty interpretation under the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, for example. And another one could be the use of analogies by investment tribunals, which was particularly interesting because investment tribunals frequently make use of analogical reasoning in very implied ways. For example, when citing to past awards, or when they're looking at different regimes to borrow principles or concepts that they could apply to cases.
Okay, thank you. A quick question that came to mind as you were speaking. So concepts, definitions of concepts are tools. They are instruments which help us do something. We come up with intellectually we come up with certain definitions of certain concepts in order to help us do something. A good definition of a concept is one that helps us do the thing that we try to do with it. And for most, I suppose, if not all concepts, there are different possible definitions. So you chose one definition of coherence because I assume you thought it helps you do something. What is that something? What is the thing that you try to achieve with the definition of coherence, with the concept of coherence that you chose? Does the question make sense? I didn't perhaps express it very well, but perhaps I did. What you?
Well, I suppose I was looking for at least a working definition to begin with that would help me get off the ground, and that's a definition I found of coherence, describing the sort of the rational connections between members of a whole amongst themselves and in relation to a governing value or principle. And it is a definition that's often used in legal literature. And I thought it was sort of abstract enough to help me get off the ground, because if one looks at the broader literature on epistemology, there are many interpretations, I guess, or understandings of what coherence would entail, and about how strongly that rational connection between members and between the members of a whole and the general principles is, or not all of which would perhaps fit the legal field. So I was drawn to this definition because it didn't seem too strict or too exacting to place on individuals who have to decide cases, by asking them, for example, that everything had to be, there had to be correspondence between every possible interpretation of the law and every possible legal principle or legal theory that could be brought to justify them. So it seemed a bit more approachable to humans, I would say.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So getting off the ground, I'll if you allow me, I'll get you back down to the ground for my next couple of questions, and then the next ones will be further up again, I suppose. So given your take on coherence, would you, for the benefit of those who have not read the book, is there really not enough of that kind of coherence in ISDS today?
So I think the issue is, I think if we look at individual cases, most of the time we would see that they exhibit some kind of coherence. They do begin from some kind of premises, and most of the time they do have rational connections between those premises and towards the outcome. The issue, I guess, sometimes is that there's no debate or argument about the premises from which one starts, or sometimes they're taken as a given. And so I think that would be the issue that I would see with coherence in investment arbitration, not necessarily the logical consequence of the decisions themselves, which quite often there is. Sometimes perhaps there's not, but quite often there is.
Okay, excellent. That will take me to my second set of questions about which, as I said, I ask as me as an arbitrator. So I am an arbitrator occasionally, and when I read your book, I wasn't entirely sure how I should change what I do in practice, how I should now change how I have been reasoning as an arbitrator so far to something more attuned to coherence, as I think you would want me to do, want us arbitrators to do. You say there is not enough discussion about the premises of the reasoning, where one comes from. So long story short, long question short, as an arbitrator, how should I transpose your recommendations into something very concrete on a day-to-day basis? If I am deliberating with two other arbitrators, how should I tell them, oh, wait a minute, the way we should do it is actually something different, and the way we should do it is what you recommend? What would that be? How would you summarize it?
So I guess I don't really see the purpose of my exposition really to offer any practical advice of how a particular case should be decided, or how. I'm not trying to advocate for a different kind of legal reasoning than what we have.
Okay.
So my thinking was that very often it's again the thing that there does not seem to be enough discussion, perhaps amongst the arbitration community, or about the premises from which we begin reasoning, and so in the context of deciding with co-arbitrators, there are features of the system that perhaps make it more difficult to deliberate and in a way that these assumptions or premises upon which people reason and produce decisions are made clear and debated. So I guess the point of the book is really more about advocating for some kind of introspection, as opposed to just advocating for a different kind of legal reasoning, or for a master rule or a master principle that would definitely give us the right answer in every case.
Okay. Just to, or perhaps two more on that line, if you allow me. The first is, you may know this this quote from Ludwig Wittgenstein, who said, when something like this: my father was a businessman, I am a businessman, I want my ideas to get something done. As a philosopher, he said, I like my ideas to get something done in practice, to change something in the real world eventually. What would that be in your case? You mentioned introspection. Is that the core thing that you would retain from this from your exposition?
I think introspection, and I also perhaps an understanding that coherence is perhaps not something that's something that's too remote or too abstract or too ideal for arbitrators or decision makers in general to strive towards, acknowledging, of course, that perfect coherence is probably an unattainable ideal, but I think an understanding that the process through which we produce our outcomes matter as much as the outcomes themselves, at least in law.
Okay. Just to the other and possibly last question, which is really practice oriented, just to clarify something which I'm not sure I got right. When you speak of legal reasoning, do you mean legal reasoning in decision making or justification of decisions, the legal reasoning of arbitrators, or do you mean the legal reasoning of people evaluating the system, of the academic community, the broader community, the political community, everyone who looks at it ISDS and says, I don't like that case, I don't like the system, or I do like it, and they do some kind of legal reasoning as well, possibly legal reasoning in the sense of, I don't agree with how the arbitrators reached that decision, or I think they got something wrong, or they missed something, or they were not self-reflexive enough, they were not introspective enough. Then again, how would I know that from the outside looking at how arbitrators make decisions? Which of the two is it? Is it both? Decision making, justification. Sorry, it could be both.
Yeah, no. It could be both, because again, everybody who reasons or takes a position on what law is essentially engaging in some kind of legal reasoning. I guess the focus on the book was more on legal reasoning by tribunals, but I think the mechanics that I try to describe should, in principle, apply to anybody who reasons about the law as an outsider, or an outsider. I mean, if someone makes the case that they do not agree with a particular case, one cannot really claim that his or she is coming as an outsider with no point of view or with no stake in the argument that he or she is making.
But then back to the arbitrator, perhaps not in a deliberation between three arbitrators, but if I sit behind my computer, I'm about to draft my award. Let's assume even I'm a sole arbitrator. I should be more introspective. How would I? What's the best thing? What's the best takeaway points that you would offer to an arbitrator who likes your ideas and like to put them in practice? If I have to be more introspective, in what way to discover what's in myself, or how should I think? How should I reason differently based on what you say in the book than what people tend usually to do?
So again, it's not really about finding a different kind of reasoning, but my approach to this in the book was, in terms of justification, was to follow the work of Rawls and his idea of the reflective equilibrium, whereby when we seek to justify our actions, Rawls argues that we should work back and forth between our judgments at any level of abstraction. So we should consider a judgment about what feels just in this particular case, about what principles we think justify those judgments, and what kind of more general theories justify accepting those judgments and those principles. And the idea is that we would try and work back and forth and bring those into a kind of equilibrium that to us has the greatest degree of persuasiveness or validity. And so I think that mode of thinking and work could be conducive towards ensuring coherence in our decisions, but also presumptively, at least, it may also be able to garner greater persuasive force for others who may assent to this position's correctness, or at least accept it as a responsible way of reaching an outcome.
Okay, makes me think of one more thing still in that league. I have not, I confess, read the book, the final book from cover to cover, partly because I had read the PhD quite in detail, so I may have missed it. Did you go into, because you mentioned Rawls, into the veil of ignorance? Because this idea that as an arbitrator, perhaps you should put yourself behind the veil of ignorance and say, how is this going to affect the world? And does my system, how does ISDS affect the world? And how would I be affected? Not knowing, behind the veil of ignorance, not knowing where I would be dropped back into society. Jumping forward a little bit, this is another question that I may come back to later on. People tend to say, the world faces two main problems nowadays: the climate, the environment, and inequalities. It has been shown here and there that ISDS contributes to making environmental protection more difficult. So it harms the world in that sense because it prevents states from passing regulation which would protect the environment. And a number of people start to say, well, ISDS really only benefits the rich, making the rich richer. It makes arguably, it increases investment flows and it makes the world as a whole richer. But most of that additional wealth would go into the pockets of the wealthy few. So that ISDS, in a sense, would make possibly, this is an extremely broad thing to say, I know, would make the two main ills of the world even worse. So if I put myself behind the veil of ignorance, how should I, assuming that all of this is empirically true, if I put myself behind the veil of ignorance, how could I take this into consideration? It's a complex question, I know. I'm making this up as I go. But did you even go into the veil of ignorance question, or is it something that you would rather not? Or, yeah, sorry.
I'll confess that I haven't really explored that avenue, like putting the arbitrator behind the veil of ignorance. I acknowledge the veil of ignorance as something that's part of Rawls's philosophy, but I'll admit that I didn't put the arbitrator behind the veil of ignorance and examine how that will change the arbitrator's attitudes. I'm not sure how I could reconstruct that thought experiment on the spot, but I would think that applying that methodology would allow, at least for some assessment or reassessment of what an arbitrator may think his or her institutional role in the system might be. And if they think that, like the example you mentioned, the problems of the dangers of climate change and how investment arbitration could be really a roadblock in mitigating the effects of climate change, then perhaps that would be a reason to reassess the institutional role, and that could flow into doctrines like, example, how much standard of review an arbitrator should accord to domestic regulatory measures that seek to mitigate against the effects of climate change. So I think there is sort of a line or a road there that we could take it from perhaps the idea of putting the arbitrator behind the veil of ignorance and towards something more concrete, but I haven't really explored it in depth in the book.
Sure, I know that's just an idea that came up as we were speaking. Okay, thank you very much. If with this, I'd like to move on to the third set of questions about the more scholarly questions. By the way, I forgot to ask, should we leave time for questions from the audience? Is this something that you usually do in these events or not?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, just for me to calibrate the timing of my questions, as it were. So back to coherence, and so you wrote about coherence in ISDS. In your view, is coherence different in ISDS than in the rest of legal reasoning? Is coherence, should investment arbitrators aspire to a different kind of coherence than judges would, or than anyone else would in the legal realm?
So I think probably the answer may be a bit yes and a no. I think the methodological aspects of what I described, or the one that I described in the book of coherence, are probably the same across legal reasoning, like I mentioned before, even for people who just offer an opinion about a particular case and how that case was decided. So, for example, the fact that I think legal reasoning is practical, which means that it depends on framing legal questions and coming up with appropriate ends to be fulfilled, or that it operates more as a web of mutually supporting propositions as opposed to a linear deduction, or the overall iterative process of justifying outcomes, which I mentioned with the example of Rawls. Those, I believe, are largely, or should be largely, the same. Where I think things may differ is with respect to what those ends to be fulfilled may be in each case, or with respect to what kind of values or principles a decision maker or adjudicator decides to use to get the reasoning off the ground. And I think this is in essence a function of the division of international law into different regimes, which they may largely pursue different aims. And these different aims may also prioritize different values or principles. And so there is a potential problem here. And again, this ties back to the climate change example you mentioned. If ISDS becomes totally isolated in its thinking and does not consider or integrate principles and values developed elsewhere in international law.
What would you say are the specific aims and values then of the investments law regime, which are different from others? What are the, I'm going back to the differences between what your book leads to for ISDS and what would lead to for trade lawyers at the WTO or WTO panelists, appellate body members. Any idea?
So, I mean, I guess the literature will tell us that, as you mentioned, investment law, investment treaties, and investment arbitration promote investment among states, which is good for overall economic development. But that is, of course, a policy goal, and I don't think that this is a goal that arbitrators should have or should seek to render the decisions in such a way that actively fulfills this role. I think arbitrators are are dispute resolving actors, and that's their institutional role in a system. And so I think the role is to resolve a dispute between the parties as accurately as possible. And accuracy could mean by taking account of the rules and past practices of the system, but also a sense of what seems just in the circumstances. And so I think the value that arbitrators should perhaps pursue in seeking to render coherent outcomes would be conviction in the principle of the outcome itself, as well as moral responsibility in how that outcome is achieved, or is the method through which it's achieved. Again, I would not see coherence as necessarily leading to an answer that everybody should immediately or necessarily accept as being always correct, because law has an arguable character, and reasonable participants can have reasonable disagreements.
Okay, thank you. How important is coherence anyway, and how important is it compared to other, possibly to other competing values, laws, not only after coherence, a perfectly coherent system, but which would be profoundly evil, would be probably pretty bad system, probably worse than a system which is equally evil but less coherent. It's a debate about that in the literature, as you probably know. But anyway, the question is again, what might be values that compete with coherence? How important is coherence? What are these other? What could be these other competing values? And may some of them be more important than coherence? Should coherence bow in front of other values and or yield in front of other values and say, if I wanted to be coherent, this is what I would do, but no, I won't do it because there's a higher value here?
And so, of course, at least in law, there are other values that we seek to achieve, right? And you know, correctness or you know, a just allocation of burdens and benefits is also what we seek to achieve, including, of course, predictability. But I wouldn't necessarily put those in opposition to coherence, because I wouldn't regard coherence as mandating pure consistency or pure logical consequence or pure predictability. So I think coherence offers a bit of a framework where we can have arguments about correctness and about predictability or about consistency competing with each other. So it's really, I see it as part of the framework through which we tend to debate those other values that are important to us in law.
But so can I almost hear you say it's all about coherence. With coherence, we can achieve everything, and coherence would allow us to balance out all of the other values of law. Did I hear you correctly? Perhaps that's a bit oversimplified, I suppose. What I said was oversimplified.
Not that it would help us balance them out, but it is a framework in which we can have different arguments about correctness or predictability compete. I don't think coherence would give us the test that would tell us which one should prevail at any different time. I think that's ultimately a moral decision that has a moral decision and a moral that requires some kind of conviction that in this particular case we should follow past practice because we think predictability might be better, or in this case we should depart from past practice because the outcome is obviously unjust. I think sort of coherence provides the framework to discuss these things. But that's because I wouldn't see coherence as being devoid of any, as being equal to absolute consistency or absolute predictability. If we interpret it that way, then yes, coherence could go too far and could lead to unjust outcomes. But I wouldn't necessarily construe coherence that way as leaving no room for these kinds of debates.
But if I can take this and go back to my question as an arbitrator, so I'm in a case and I realize there is fairly consistent case law on a topic, and the BIT leaves me not that much room. It's all of that pushes me to a given outcome. If in my mind, in my simple mind, I would say simple in the sense of not having the full breadth of reasoning that you have in your book. In my simple mind about coherence, I would say, well, the coherent answer here, the coherent solution would be the following. But fundamentally, I find this wrong. I can't explain why, but I think no, we couldn't do that. This would be or let's take and simplify the facts of the famous Philip Morris and Australia case. Let's change the situation and the rules a bit, and it would lead me to say, well, yes, Australia has to pay compensation for Philip Morris because they expropriated Philip Morris of its intellectual property, and then that would be the coherent answer. Then I say, no, I will not do that. As a human being, I cannot do that. I can't really say why. How would your book help me solve that moral conundrum between that's what I think the law, quote unquote, compels me to do, and that's what my soul tells me to do? Well, how does your book help me resolve that situation, that conundrum? It's a tricky one, perhaps. Yes.
I wouldn't know if my book would give a particular surefire test, but in this case, I mean, just saying that, for example, the trademarks had been expropriated. I mean, based on what? That requires some kind of legal analysis. So we cannot just decide this just by looking at past cases. Past cases might give us examples of where arbitrators have decided similar things in the past, but we still have to decide whether the case before us is similar enough to those past cases to follow the same outcome. And we also have to decide if following the same outcome in this case would comport with a sense of what seems just in those circumstances. So I guess the book will not really give a test but it may give perhaps strategies, I suppose, and sort of trying to distinguish the past case from the present case could be one such strategy, or trying to rethink the institutional role or the standard of review could be another such strategy. And Philip Morris is an interesting example, because that was really a point of disagreement between, in the Philip Morris Uruguay case, between the majority and the dissent. The majority essentially confirmed the tobacco control legislation, basically saying that they did not see a manifest lack of reasons or manifest arbitrariness in the legislation, whereas the dissent took a more inquisitive standard of review and as a result found the opposite. So I guess it would really be about being cognizant of these strategies that we could use to bring our moral intuitions and the path of the system up to this date into what seems to us an equilibrium. I would say.
Would your argument change if we clearly separated analytically decision-making and justification, that we said what you find in these cases, the reasoning in this Philip Morris case that you mentioned was the following: this is justification, this is what we see, or as you said, we can distinguish a case, we can distinguish it from a precedent, we can interpret margin of appreciation, whatever, in different ways, and a standard of review in different ways. That may be how we get it done as an arbitrator. I come to a decision, I say, no, I will not award any compensation. Okay, now how am I going to, if you will, reverse engineer the written decision, the justification that I will have in the decision? My decision is already made. My decision was made on certain reasons, some of which of course were unconscious to me, and others were conscious to me, and they lead me to the conclusion, I repeat, no, I will not award compensation. I cannot do that. Now, the trick for me will be to find justifications that I can put into the text. These would be, I repeat, things like distinguishing it from a precedent, or was playing with the standard of review, or anything of that kind. Would what your book says apply differently to decision making, legal reasoning in decision making, and to legal reasoning in justification? Would it apply equally to both, or would it to put it a bit brutally, I suppose, we all do unspeakable things when we think. We let our deeper ideologies seep into the decision making, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, and they are unspeakable in the sense that we can't speak them in the justification. We can't put them in the justification. Discussions I have had with arbitrators, for instance, said things like, in discussions I had with arbitrators, they would say things like, we need to discipline these rogue countries. Come on, we know how the world runs. These countries from the south, come on, we need to civilize them. They would go as far as to say that. They would never say that in a decision, of course. And as you may know, there has been this series of interviews conducted by Todd Tucker with arbitrators, and he identified just underneath the surface, in a number of them, not all of them, but in a number of them, a pretty strong form of racism, and which may explain some of the decisions, and that they tend to differ between decisions in which an emerging developing country is involved and in which a developed country is involved as respondent. That my question had many facets. I understand. What is there any of them that is of interest to you?
No, it's a very interesting question. I'll just perhaps try to latch onto the last part.
Yeah.
I think I would hope that the sort of the broader method I try to describe would be helpful both when we try to put. Actually, I would hope they would be helpful in the decision-making aspect, because as you allude to, the putting the things on paper is to some extent kind of a performative act, because we've already come to a decision. Now we have to write it in a way that persuades the audience that it's the best decision. So I think the method, I hope the method would work already at the decision-making process. And I think a key aspect here is being open and conscious about the assumptions that come into our thinking, about what is right and wrong, about what should be done. And so to the extent that the thinking may be that we need to discipline rogue and civilized states, that maybe not is, maybe it's not the kind of thinking that we should start with when we try to reason in these cases. So I think this I would call it in the book being reflective or being reflexive, and I think that would be essential to how practical deliberation in general works, including, I think, also in legal reasoning. And so yes, I mean, I would say that this is we cannot do without this in any kind of decision making, including, of course, investment arbitration. And so the danger, the problem is how we achieve this, not just in the context of one individual adjudicator or arbitrator, but also in the context of an entire arbitral panel. And this is where I think the book kind of stops, and I don't really have an answer for that in the book itself. So this is really the conundrum that I'm left with.
Absolutely. There's, if I may, you didn't cover it in the book as well, but it's about what we can do with the book. And now the question that's going to come is not so much about it's a practical question, but not so much a question about for arbitrators, but about what to do with the system practically. Okay, it's where I'm coming from is this. I had another PhD student also at King's who did a PhD on the psychological dimensions of arbitrator decision making, and essentially, and among the different things that she did is interviewing arbitrators about their cognitive biases. Their unconscious cognitive biases. And interestingly enough, a number of arbitrators responded, I don't have cognitive biases. / I have all my cognitive biases under control, which already says quite a bit about how self-reflexive they are about their capacity of being self-reflexive. Essentially, that someone would say, I know all of my biases and I have them all under control is, I don't know, these people must think of themselves as robots or as different from the rest of humanity, because we all have biases which we are unaware of and which therefore we cannot control. What your book and the part on self-reflexivity and being self-reflective or self-reflexive, what it suggests to me is, and that's the question I'd like to ask you, is do you think that arbitrators should go through mandatory de-biasing training, things where you, I don't know if you have done that. I've done that, and it's extremely interesting, where an online system asks you different questions and they measure the speed at which you answer questions, and at which you attribute a certain conduct to a man or woman or to a person of color or to a white person, and so on and so forth. And the extent and the kind of biases that come out of all of these de-biasing trainings are pretty staggering, based on the studies I have seen. So assuming that arbitrators are well-intentioned, assuming that I'm now taking out those I mentioned early on who say we need to educate these rogue countries, but arbitrators who say, no, I just do my job. I want to be coherent. I want to apply the overall values of the system to the case at hand, and I want it to be congruent with neighboring fields, with environmental law, and so on and so forth. I want to do it right, but I'm not perfect because I'm a human being. So perhaps I should do some de-biasing training to understand where I misinterpret the facts and the law, and where I filter the world in a biased way. Is this something that you would think is a good idea?
I mean, I don't know if I would necessarily go as far and suggest that, but at the same time, I would say that I don't know if just taking the training is a suggestion, but trying to uncover whatever biases we may have in decision making is important. And one would hope that just having a collegial body deciding a case as opposed to a single person would achieve that, and to the extent that this may not be the case in reality, then we have to find ways to improve it. At the same time, I don't think my book would advocate at the same. I think it's what you said. At the same time, at the end we're all human at the end of the day, and so we may not always get it right. We may not always be able to decide in an unbiased way. So perhaps, short of going to training, the way that we might address this in the meantime would be by increasing the pool of arbitrators, or the diversity of arbitrators. If we're concerned that the pool of the most prominent arbitrators is too homogeneous or too uniform, then maybe it's good reason to increase diversity and have more voices that could challenge the existing voices. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We are coming close to the end of today's allocated time. There are 2 questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. Would you like to have a look at them and see if you can answer them in the remaining 2 minutes?
Yeah. So the first question is, they're asking, I would like to hear your insights on the relation between coherence and judicial borrowing, in particular citing other courts and tribunals, example, the ICJ, by investor state arbitration tribunals. Would you agree that such a practice is a manifestation of coherence, both internal and external? I would say yes. In essence, citing to other awards is an exercise in analogical reasoning, and so making sure that analogies is well drawn out involves some processes like making sure that the 2 cases have enough similarities in between them. There are structural parallels between the 2, so that the similarities we identify seem to serve similar purposes. And so I would see that as a manifestation of attempts to ensure coherence between, in this case, investment arbitration and what seems to be, in the case of the ICJ, for example, general international law. The second question asks, do you consider there is a significant difference between coherence and cohesion in the ISTS framework, particularly in relation to legal arguments constructed by decision makers, arbitrators, experts, and mediators? If so, do you think it is cohesion or textual coherence that would contribute to a robust precedence within ISTS context? So this introduces the idea of cohesion. So in trying to understand what cohesion and how it differs to coherence, I mean, I looked a bit into literary writings, and they would sort of define coherence as the general sense of a text, and cohesion the syntax, how the words relate to each other. So so in this sense, I'm not sure I understand the reference to cohesion, and there's difference between coherence in this case. On the second part of the question, do you think it is cohesion or textual coherence that would contribute to a robust precedence? A problem with investment law, of course, is that there are many treaties and there's no single text. At the same time, we do see that arbitrators have sort of begun converging meanings along at least aspects of it, in particular fair and equitable treatment, or what constitutes indirect expropriation, regardless of any textual differences that one may see in treaties. So it is something that arbitrators, I think, are trying to do case by case. But at the same time, if there is a single text that has all the substantive rules and substantive principles, that would be more conducive towards I suppose overall textual coherence on the long run.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we have come to the end of this wonderful session. Many congratulations again on your book. Thank you very much for having me today for this discussion. I hope it helped. I hope it helped bring out some of the possible further avenues that may of what one might do with the thoughts that you expressed in the book, where they might go. Perhaps you'll want to take them somewhere. We didn't have time to talk about your future projects, but and perhaps other people will take these ideas into different directions. It's a very inspiring book, I think. So thank you so much. I think Jan Calamita wanted to come back and say a few closing words.
Thanks very much, Thomas, and thanks very much, Haralampos, for an exceptionally stimulating discussion of what is, I think, a powerfully thought-provoking book, and one that is of obvious interest to those who think about these issues as a matter of legal philosophy, but also really of importance for those working at the coalface, so to speak, considering how best to reform ISDS and how to address this issue of coherence as a practical matter in a world in which we have nearly 2,500 very often heterogeneous texts, and that's whether as a matter of arbitration, sitting as an arbitrator, or as a policymaker. So thank you both very much for bringing out the ideas and beginning to elucidate some of the issues. And Harry, congratulations on the book. Before we go, I just want to let you know about another online seminar that we'll be having from the Investment Law and Policy Group here at the Center for International Law, a book launch event for a new book by CIL's own Dr. Yawen Zheng, China's Foreign Investment Legal Regime Towards China's Development, published by Brill in 2023. And that seminar will be on the 15th of June. Thanks very much for joining us. I hope to see you then. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.